I ran a half marathon when I was just 15. It happened the previous summer. And it's a pretty long story. It started around April, so almost a year ago. I was like 5 months into self-improvement, and I was a degenerate. I was hanging out with my degenerate friends on a Saturday night, and you can assume what sort of activities we were up to. Sorry for the interruption. If you want me to spell it out for you, we were smoking pretty much everything. Cigarettes, cigars, vapes, even weed. It wasn't a great moment for my self-improvement journey. And it was definitely not the path I wanted to follow. Definitely not what I had chosen to live through the moment I decided to start self-improvement when I had just turned 15. I remember waking up the very next morning and I just felt off of it. My usual energy, athleticism just felt worn off. But I also felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. The last time I had felt it was when I had just turned 15, and it was what had led me to starting this self-improvement journey. Dissatisfaction. I wanted to make up for my mistakes the previous night. I wanted to prove to myself that I was still that energetic athlete that could work out every day and get to big things if he continued on that route. After midday, I just finished my usual workout and I felt I had to do more. So I decided to go for a run. Now, this wasn't the usual run where I'd run around my block. It was around 4 kilometers. No. I was gonna just run straight and see how far I could get. So I put on my trainers, I put on a sports t-shirt, and I started running. And I ran, and after 4.5 kilometers, which was the distance I usually run, I decided to start running back. it just took another 500 meters when my body, which had just consumed all that smoke and wasn't used to running such a length, started to feel ill. I felt like puking, but I kept on going. I ignored what my lizard brain was telling me to do, to quit, and I ran until it was just around 200 meters left. And those last 200 meters were uphill. But I didn't let that deter me, so I kept on going. I ran, and I remember getting to the top that my legs didn't work. My body was aching and I was almost completely out of breath, but I kept on going. I ran an extra 50 meters and I got back to my house. I checked my phone and I had ran 9 kilometers. A personal best. That was the moment I knew that if I put my mind to it, if I gave up all of those bad activities, those bad habits, and dedicated all my energy into running, I knew I could get to way longer distances. I knew I had to dedicate myself into running as far as I could for the next 1 or 2 months. Two weeks later, I put on my trainers again and I pushed for a longer distance. I ran, I got to 7 kilometers and started to run back. Came back home and saw that I had ran a total of 14 kilometers. A new personal best. I was already planning my next run. I knew I had to get to 22 kilometers, which was a half marathon. 2 weeks later, what happened? I was at home, scrolling on YouTube and doing nothing. I don't remember why I wasn't at school that time. It was probably some sort of holiday. But I was at home, I had done nothing that whole day, and I was literally just watching mindless content on YouTube. But I felt something again. That same thing that I had felt the day I had ran the 9 kilometers. Dissatisfaction. I knew I had to do something productive that day. Something that would make me remember that day. I had to be my personal best again. So I put my trainers on, I put my shorts on, put my t-shirt on and went off. 100 100 meters in, and my lizard brain was already telling me to stop. You've made your point, you've made your point, you've done something productive, now turn back. That day, I strangely managed to callous my brain with ease. I forced my body to continue. I knew that there was still a long, long distance to come. And so I ran. I got to those usual 5 kilometers where I'd start to feel ill, I start feeling the will to puke. But I kept on going, and I reached 8 kilometers. My lizard brain was as loud as ever. If you turn back now, you'll get to 16 kilometers. That's another personal best. You want to run those 22 kilometers at half marathon? You can run it next time. I ignored it. I knew I had to get to that 11-kilometer mark, run back, and complete the half marathon. And so I ran, got to that 11-kilometer mark and started to run back. It was far from over. It was far, far from over. I remember running back, I saw the bus which took me home pass by. That lizard brain of mine tried to trick me into taking it, but I ignored it. I kept on running and I got to 17 kilometers. Already past my personal best. I was almost completely out of energy. My muscles ached. My legs felt like dead weights pulling me down. I was almost walking. And suddenly I felt something move behind me and I had just been overtaken. Overtaken by someone who had ran a quarter of what I had ran and was obviously running at a way higher pace. Something in me reawakened yet again. Guess what? Dissatisfaction. My competitive nature. I started to sprint. Sprint as fast as I had ever sprinted, and I overtook that person. That person stopped running and I felt a slight moment of victory. Yet, there was still much to run. Finally, there were just barely 200 meters left. I ran, and it was all over. I had just run a half marathon. I hope you enjoyed that story, but we've just talked about how I managed to run a half marathon. Now, let's talk about how you could do it. So I have a couple of notes written down and a couple of tips to give you. But first of all, I have to be honest. If you're watching this video, it's very possible that you're maybe not an expert in long distance running. You may be skinny fat, you may be just fat, and you've seen someone of my age run a half marathon, and so you click this video out of shock. I must be honest. The fact that I managed to run such long distances at my age has to do a lot with my genetics. My mother was a runner, my father was a runner, and chances are you haven't had the same lucky genetics as I have. But think of it this way. There's someone living in this same planet who's in the same conditions as you, both economic and physical, who's had a similar life to you, who probably has run a half marathon. You may have heard of David Goggins. Just maybe 2 weeks ago, I finished reading his book, Can't Hurt Me. And I was also planning to make a guide on that, which I might release if this video gets a certain amount of likes. He managed to get to 100 miles, 150 miles. And he managed to run those long distances starting as a morbidly obese individual. So although I've been quite lucky with genetics, there are people who haven't, who have managed to run even longer distances than me. Now, I've got a couple of points to talk about regarding different tips that could help you when running long distances. And the first one is progressive overloading. I don't know if I'm gonna put some weird writing on the screen, but it doesn't really matter, honestly. So, progressive overloading. When talking about my story, you've seen that I didn't start on 22 kilometers. I started at 9 kilometers, then went to 15 kilometers, then went to 22 kilometers. And you do the same. Maybe start with shorter distances, especially if you're not used to running. Start, I don't know, at just 1 kilometer, get to 5 kilometers, then go a bit slower. But I'm certain you've already heard the concept of progressive overloading. Second of all, I have to do shorter distances, but to do them faster. See, even now I still do run shorter distances like a 4 kilometer, a 5 kilometer, but when I run them, I do them at a way faster pace. Even now, every week I have training. I've got training like 3 times, and playing the sport that I play, I'm used to running a lot, and obviously running shorter distances, but sprinting and running them at a higher pace. So, well, I've discovered that when you run longer distances, the fact that you don't really run them at a high pace kind of gives you that extra motivation to keep on running and running and running. So maybe when doing that progressive overloading, when starting at 10, 15, then going to 17, in between you can even do these short kind of 5 kilometer runs, but just do them at a way higher pace. I don't know if I'm going too fast now. Never mind. Last thing I wanted to say, the last suggestion I have, is to not use a treadmill. I think that using a treadmill takes away a lot of that motivation. Let's consider this hypothetical. Well, not really hypothetical because it actually happened. When I was running my 22-kilometer run, my half marathon, and I was, let's say, in that middle point where I still had like 9 kilometers left to run, I knew that if I stopped then, I'd have to find a way to get back home. From that 9 kilometer distance, I had to either walk or get the bus, and so it was a lot more inconvenient to stop. Instead, if you're maybe at the gym and you're using a treadmill, as soon as you finish running, when you stop running, you're pretty much already where you want to be. You don't have to think about getting back home. That isn't the main concern. So I think that running out in the open instead of using a treadmill gives you that extra layer of motivation and kind of helps stop you from quitting. I think that's an interesting point. And I've never really been a fan of treadmill, of the treadmill. And I've always kind of preferred running out in the open because you get the fresh air, you get to see people, and you get to see nature, and I think that's very important. I hope that this video has helped you. Keep a strong mind and stay like a lion.